Okay, scholars, it's European Intellectual History class, and what we're doing today is we are looking at the university and sort of at the end of this European intellectual trajectory. Basically, the university that's given to us today. It comes out of the 19th century German universities, University of Berlin. And so what we want to do in this class is always keep our track. We are not just the sort of like history of people thinking, and we're not the history of great thoughts. We are also not the history of a specific like biology or science. We're a history of how people think, but then also how that thinking gets institutionalized, structured, and given practical trajectory so it can help church, state, society, other things like that. Okay, there's a sociology to knowledge. There's a history on the ground to knowledge, which is often we sort of think knowledge just exists in sort of an ethereal sort of world. No, it's got a sociology, it's got a history. And this is the European intellectual history class that we're talking about, how it gets to us. So, you know, this is the world we live in. And in this world today of like Berkeley, Sather Tower, you know, University of Beijing, University of Kuala Lumpur, universities of all around the world, you can transfer in and out of this place because the structures of knowledge, the structures of intellectual life are pretty much established as similar, global around the world. And this reading that I've got you doing today is the foundation for that globalization of a system built around professionalization and research, okay? But we'll get there. Wanted to start off, you know, we've dealt with Plato, Aristotle in this class, and especially Augustine, who sort of put together this sort of Christian idea of a seven liberal arts that had come out of there. And they work together, but they're real different. They're a very different bunch of things, the seven liberal arts. And there's other liberal arts too. Humility is in this mix too. And remember that the object, as we talked about it, is sort of a creation of beings. Not hero scientists, not philosophers and theologians. The system of knowledge was to create a sort of scribal culture, which was a bunch of folks who could serve the church and the state. Okay, church and state are both involved. And the book talks about that with Augustine, you're reading. Then in the universities of the Middle Ages, we talked about how they get structured in a very sort of interesting, sort of backhanded way. No one sat back and goes, oh, let's create universities. No, we actually don't have that. What we have is students and faculty, as you saw in that readings that we had about the founding of Oxford. Students would sort of chase a person to study under, and person to study under would have to deal with some students, and there needed to be some rules and structures to this. And so bishops would give a charter, a license, a university license, which is what this was, and so that you could be part of an institution of which there was a curriculum, and you went through it and you got a sort of certificate at the end. And it's like being a master and apprentice in the building trades. You have master's degrees, and then you have these baccalaureates, these apprentice students, you know, going through. So these very interesting things were established and set up. And then by the, you know, 17th, 18th century, they're spread out and they're being very successful. But this is Harvard in, you know, 1728 or so. Notice it's not a university, does not have a charter. It's got the prospect of the colleges. Each one of these is a college, and there's no university charter for Harvard until after the American Revolution. But the thing is that we talked about a lot going on at Harvard. There's a lot of intellectual stuff, a lot of interesting stuff, and we have scientists involved and things like that. But that is not the center of intellectual life. Thomas Brattle is the treasurer of this school. He is not a professor here. There is no professor here. And then we talked about how, like, Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle is never a member of a college or a university faculty or anything. Haley eventually is. Newton is. But that's not because universities were central to the existence. The Royal Society, a whole different organization, is set up. And that's actually doing most of what we think of as the university research and stuff today. So the 18th century had this sort of hodgepodge of things where the universities are in the mix, but not at the center of the mix in any way. Okay? Well, that's going to change with this guy. This is Wilhelm. He's the brother of Alex that we talked about last time. And he and Fish and Schleiermacher are the three guys who petitioned Friedrich William III to establish the University of Berlin on new principles. And so that's what we're interested in. And you and I, as much as we're going to wear funky, goofy things at graduation, you know, flat hats and robes and call ourselves masters and all that sort of stuff, the actual foundation of our ideas are really 19th century German. Okay? And this is a wonderful article here I wanted you to read. A chapter of the introduction out of Tal Howard's book. Tal Howard's this amazingly smart guy, and I think that his books are really good. And he's a Christian college faculty. Was at Gordon College when he wrote this on the history department. So let's go into this a little bit. So what we're talking about here is how the Enlightenment shakes up the universities. The Enlightenment, the Enlightenment University gets shooken up. Okay, the folks who come into the French Revolution don't like how the Enlightenment 18th century universities are working. And so there's actually a type of like antagonism to them. One of the most amazing things, and Howard brings this out, is given the greatness of the university today throughout the whole world, this massive influence, there was a moment there at the end of the 18th century where universities could have just fallen apart and remained backwater institutions like they always had. They got transformed. This is one of the things about history. They're not transformed by, some philosopher like Kant. They are actually transformed by administrative minds like Wilhelm Humboldt and then the state getting involved. Okay, and that's what this is about. So if the universities were backward institutions, their theological faculties were especially backward. This is after the French Revolution. Let's get rid of let's abolish, the theological faculties. Why would we even have them at a university? And so this article goes on. This is fascinating history, but just in a real quick way, the story of the birth of the modern university is ultimately connected to the development of German, particularly Prussian Protestant institutions. We really don't go back to Oxford. We really don't go back to University of Paris. We go back to University of Berlin, a Protestant university founded in 1810. What this Prussian model would be admired and imitated throughout the continent, and eventually would cross the English Channel and the Atlantic, and then it will become the global standard of universities around the world. This is largely where, like, I have a PhD degree. That degree is a research degree. I never took a teaching class in my life, and you might, oh, yeah, that's why I teach this way, is because no one ever taught me to teach. I was in a research university learning how to research and write books, and then, oh, by the way, here, go teach some people and earn some money on the side. So this system that gets created is this German system, all right, that we're talking about here. So he goes on, and then there's some very interesting stuff here. Basically, what's going on is the scientization of things. Is there's a type of project. If you're going to get the Prussian government to pay for this, and it's going to be expensive, is you got to give the Prussian government something. What's the Prussian government want? Well, it wants research in areas that will support the state, especially technological developments, professionalization of all sorts of things. Should they have a faculty of theology? Is that worth the money? And yes, it's worth the money if that faculty doesn't support the churches, but supports the state. See, the theological faculty at these Protestant universities ceases to be confessionalized, doing different like Lutheran versus Calvinist versus, things like denominations, and instead becomes a sort of generic research faculty looking at what? Looking at Bible, looking at theological issues and stuff like that, all in the name of what? Ultimately the state. You're not in the service of the church, you're in the service of the state because the state is paying the bills. A very important concept here that he talks about here, we'll talk a little bit about next time, is there's this notion of academic freedom. Well, hopefully you realize that there's no such thing as freedom. So who's paying for what you're doing is very important. And so your freedom is, academic freedom is the freedom to disagree with your church, the freedom to not follow your church, but the freedom to, you better do what the state says. So you see the theological faculties get co-opted at Protestant universities in Britain, or in Germany. And so this is a lot of fun here. And I wanted to get to this here to show you. Okay, so what you have is this separation of science, learning, and faith, and this notion that what Augustine had said, there's a separation of the city of the earth and the city of God, and that we're walking in this world in between the two. But normative theology was regarded as essentially supra-scientific, wary of worldly political powers, integrally tied to doctrinal, spiritual, and practical concerns of the church in the ecclesia. That's the way the pre-modern university worked, and that's not going to be the way the later university worked. See, theological faculties in Germany grew indifferent to the problems of the church. They're more interested in the, problems that they sort of create for themselves, questions they ask themselves. Now, this term Erastian, the Erastian measures of early 19th century were tied to the novel supraconfessional conception of Christianity prevalent among key sectors of the Prussian state. Okay, supraconfessional means above confessions. That means different. We're not interested in your Lutheran versus Catholic issues. We want something bigger, something that holds us all together. Erastian means that it's the church and the state very closely tied together. In fact, the church being subservient to the state in effect. Okay, so the politics of confessional harmony become very important. As augmented in the 19th century, to validate the state as a positive moral force and define religion, not in particular creedal terms, but in terms that emphasizes religious morality and things that support the state. So fundamentally, religion should teach ethics and virtue that will support the state and a citizen. Okay, so a lot of the extra stuff that Augustine would have thought, the biblical stuff that's, Augustine perceived all of education in order to understand the Bible as the central thing so that we can understand everything else through the eyes of the Bible. The Bible is now gone, and we want the religion to be basically theological faculty to be studying more ethical, virtuous issues which will ultimately support the state. Okay? And then if we go and we'll finish up here, the implications of this religious policy for the study of, for clergymen is threefold. First of all, the university is educating clergy to be more latitudinarian. That means sort of spread out, not really thinking specifically about, denominational issues like predestination, that will create conflict, but putting things out. not apologetic. You're not trying to defend doctrines of the Bible or anything. You're trying to be scientific. And that's this sort of research side of things. The way you largely co-opt in this is, how do you get promoted? You get promoted by publishing. How do you publish? You publish in scientific journals, theologically perceived as a type of science, you know. Much vaunted academic freedom coexisted uneasily with the state's control of higher education. This is the second part. And then the third part is finally the government became more involved in actual composition of theological faculties. Who gets promoted? Who gets hired? It's largely off of ideals set up by the government. Now, this then leads into the foundation of, you know, if you go to universities, a lot of the great universities have chapels and stuff like that. Stanford has a chapel and stuff on it. And but these chapels, the universities' religion departments become more like described here, and this becomes the model for the rest of the world. Now later on, you're going to turn these religion faculties into finally what we would call religious studies departments or something like that at a major university. Much of the break off of colleges like Point Loma Nazarene or a Wheaton College or a Biola are because of dissatisfaction with what's going on there in the German model. But in every one of our institutions, you have to get accredited. The accreditation comes to the state. So a lot of these ideas of scientific thought and ideas of diminished confessionalism and stuff like that all gets worked out, so that in many ways, we, in our little universities, Christian colleges, are distinct, but not that distinct. I was hired here because I have certain credentials and I fit within a certain professionalization block that made me acceptable to accreditation institutions. The Christianness had definite play in being hired here, but I could not have gotten hired here unless I had already done the due diligence in terms of certain professionalizations set up by things like the University of Berlin. So with that, it'd be fun if we could talk, but we're going to start to pull all this together, and we've only got 1 week left, but hope all's going well out there with you. This would, you know, if you feel, give me a call, send me an email, you know, I'd love to hear from you.